Welcome all of you to tonight's Green Living Seminar virtual presentation. I'm Elena Traister. I'm a professor in the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts Environmental Studies Department. This semester's Green Living Seminar is organized around the theme Individual Actions and Environmental Sustainability. All webinars are free and open to the public. They take place on Wednesdays at 5:30. You can register online at www.mcla.edu/greenliving, where you can also find podcasts of previous presentations. You'll also be able to find videos of this semester's presentations on our YouTube channel. Today's presentation will last about 45 minutes and will be followed by a question and answer session. The Q&A box will be open, so you're welcome to submit your questions for the concluding Q&A session at any point during the presentation. A quick announcement for next week's presentation before I announce today's speaker. On Wednesday, February 3rd, Rachel Fay, Senior Director of Public Policy at Power to Decide, will present a lecture titled Preventing Unplanned Pregnancy. Today's presentation on individual actions and climate change, which are most effective, will be given by Dr. Seth WYNES, postdoc at Concordia University. His research on climate change mitigation has been featured in the New York Times, NBC, and the CBC. He is also the author of a short book on individual climate action published with Penguin Random House, SOS, What You Can Do to Reduce Climate Change. I'm so glad to have you joining us virtually. Thanks so much for doing this, Seth. I'll turn this over to you.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'm excited to talk to you folks tonight about a little bit of my research and some of the things that I've learned in the last 4 or 5 years. So we'll be talking about individual actions and climate change. I thought that I would start out by making sure that we're all kind of on the same footing just regarding the severity of this situation. And so I wanted to acknowledge this idea that we are currently living in a 1-degree world, a world where global average temperatures are actually 1.1 degrees higher than they were in pre-industrial times. And already we've started to see some of the really painful side effects of that warmed world. And so this was a photo taken during the Australian wildfires, where a young woman took her family out onto the water to escape the flames on the shore. And it's these kinds of images that are becoming more common and give us a little bit of insight into our future. We don't want to be in a world that's any warmer than it already is. This is why different nations around the world have agreed to a sort of aspirational target of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now that wouldn't...
Just a sec, you're not actually showing your screen yet.
Oh, goodness. Thank you for jumping in there.
No problem.
Let's see. Okay, all good?
Looks great.
Okay, thank you for catching me on that. Yeah, so as I was saying, this photo was taken during the Australian wildfires, and I just wanted to use it as a reminder of the severity of the situation that we're in and why we should desire to limit warming any further so that the situation doesn't become any more bleak, because 1 degree is already, to many people, kind of disastrous, and it only gets worse at 1.5 or 2 degrees. And so the international community has agreed we want to aim for 1.5, but certainly limit warming to be less than 2. And yet currently we're on pace for something more like 3 degrees of warming, which would be just a really catastrophic situation for humanity. So I would then ask us, like, what can we do about it? This was something that I came across a lot when I taught high school science. Just most of my students we're interested in that aspect of the problem. Well, like, okay, so there's this big problem. Is there anything that we can do about it? And that was something that spurred on my research and my master's project and the projects I did during my PhD. But before I get into those, I wanted to sort of address the bigger picture, which is there's often this sort of conflict or disagreement on whether we should focus on individual actions or systemic change. And one thing that comes up a lot that I would just use as an introduction is a sort of meme that, well, you can focus on your own car driving, but be aware that only 100 companies cause 70% of global emissions. And so that can be a little bit deflating. But I wanted to just break that down and engage with that idea. So where does it come from, this idea of 100% of companies cause 70% of emissions? Well, it's from a report, the Carbon Measures report by Richard Head. If you dig into the details a little bit more, these 100 companies account for 71% of global industrial greenhouse gas emissions. So not all emissions, right? We emit greenhouse gases by burning forests to make room for cattle. That would be landscape emissions. It wouldn't fall under industrial. So industrial is one slice of the pie, and 70% of that comes from companies. But when we say that it comes from companies, what we really mean is that it comes from companies that are providing us with the goods that we are incentivizing them to make. So this is a quotation from Richard Head, the author of that report, saying that it's consumers that actually burn and create the demand for the fuels that these companies are providing. So you might say, well, that's fine, but we should force the companies to clean up their act still, even though the companies are providing us with goods, cars, gasoline, jet fuel for our flights, and so on. But even if you do take that at face value and say it's the companies that need to change, or it's the governments that change, I would then encourage you to turn that question around and say, okay, what are you going to do to make them change? Is rather than standing back and absolving yourself of responsibility, is there some way for you to engage? And so the first half of this talk, I'm going to be looking at some of the individual sort of more consumer-oriented actions that we can take. And then I'm going to switch and talk a little bit about those systemic actions or more communal or collective actions that we could also take and which ones that we should focus on. So one nice thing about looking at consumer actions is that it's really easy to compare them in an apples to apples way. We can use these methods called life cycle assessment or life cycle analysis. Life cycle assessment breaks down the greenhouse gases that are emitted at each stage of a product's use. So let's say if we were talking about a cell phone, you would find out, okay, how much greenhouse gases were used while extracting materials, while mining the metals that are going to go into your phone. And then how much emissions were made transporting those materials to a factory. Then while you're at the factory, that factory uses energy, how much emissions are made there, and so on, all the way to the product being used. So you plug it into a wall, you can measure how many watts it uses to charge that phone every night. Then you can look at your electrical grid and say, okay, this many watts requires this much greenhouse gases because our electricity grids aren't fossil free yet. And then you can even include end of life in your calculation of the footprint of that product. And sometimes a product's footprint will actually go down when you include end of life, basically because you're recycling the product and then finding ways for less raw material extraction for the next phone that needs to be produced, right? And so this is a well-established methodology. There are hundreds, thousands of studies out there on all sorts of different products, and you can use these different methods to compare products. So you can say, well, is an electric vehicle actually better than an internal combustion vehicle? And the answer is yes, because you can compare not just how much gasoline the internal combustion vehicle uses, but how much energy is used in your electric vehicle. And over the course of their entire lifetime, you're going to find that electric vehicles come out way ahead. And so by looking across a whole bunch of these different studies, I compiled the results and compared actions. And getting a little ahead of myself, I guess to break that down a little further again, for a single study, you could say, okay, so manufacturing a car, this was in 2003, some of these values are lower now, but making a car just on its own before it's been driven off the lot, 10 tons of CO2 are produced. And refining the fuel that's used over that lifetime, another 10. But most of the car's emissions are created just by burning gasoline in the engine. And so, like I said, that's the kind of information that goes into this meta-analysis that I did. And you can see that on the left, we have the actions that you might actually hear quite a bit about, certainly. I found that these were the actions that get a lot of mention in high school textbooks and even government recommendations. So things like upgrade your light bulbs. At the time, there was a lot of focus on compact fluorescence. Now we would pretty much say like upgrade to an LED, but you can still find incandescents in people's houses, and it's a good thing to do, but it's not that impactful. Similarly, recycling or finding ways to conserve energy around your house, these are good things, but they're not very high impact. And when you move to further to the right of this, we have actions that are high impact across the developed world. And so I would really focus on eating a plant-based diet, avoiding air travel, and living car-free. Certainly, there are different versions of these that are also can be a big chunk of your carbon footprint. So switching from an electric car to car-free, or switching from car-free to an electric car. Those are good things. Mostly, I just try and phrase it in the absolute way, partially because it's cleaner to communicate the quantities there, but also because if you're very serious about climate change, you might want to engage with it in the fullest way possible. And also at the far end of the graph, I've included the action have one fewer child, which is really controversial and got me in, I don't know, I don't want to say a lot of trouble, but has added stress and much hate mail to my life. But we included it under the idea that you can measure it, and each additional person on this earth uses more resources. And right now, more resources means more greenhouse gases being burnt and a larger contribution to climate change. Now, that being said, the world that we should be moving towards is one where we rely on clean energy, where your vehicles are completely clean, and where each additional person uses fewer resources, and those resources are decarbonized. So hopefully that bar does not always remain the same size. And I think generally it's a good idea to sort of aim for reduced consumption. And I do focus less on that, but if we want to talk about that in the questions, I'm still happy to do so. However, going forward, I want to focus on a few actions: eating a plant-based diet, avoiding one round-trip transatlantic flight, living car-free, and sort of asking, why are those high impact? Why do they make so much more than some of these other things like recycling that I hear so much about? What can we do about them? How ingrained are they in our culture? And so on. So first of all, this idea of living car-free. Why are there so much emissions from a car's life cycle? One thing that I kind of use to illustrate this idea is to think about biking. So when you're driving your car, the car itself is very heavy. Only 5% of a car's mass comes from its passengers and the things that they carry. That means that when you're moving around the city, you're burning a lot of energy just moving this giant steel frame from one area to another, and not as much of a fraction of your energy moving yourself. So if we thought about a bike in the same proportions, that would be kind of like chaining a 950 kilogram weight to the back of your bike. And you would look at that and say, wow, that's incredibly inefficient. What a terrible way to move people around your city. And you'd be right. That would be a bad idea in terms of energy. And that's what we've settled on for most of our major cities. But I'm going to spend a little bit more time ragging on cars than that, because the situation is perhaps even worse or more grim, because not only are cars inefficient just in terms of a way to move people, but they are inefficient in terms of how much space they occupy in a city. So this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek demonstration of how much space a car takes up compared to bikes. And that has ramifications for city spacing. So another image, another way to look at this. What this means is that we have to allocate more of our space in our cities to storing cars, but also more of our space in our cities to just moving cars from point A to point B. So you don't need 4 lanes of traffic to move this many people, as long as they're on bikes or walking, but you definitely do need 4 lanes of traffic if you want to move that many cars. And the result of that is that our cities end up being more spread out just by the sheer amount of surface area that's occupied by vehicles. So now a car-centered model for living creates these cities that are expanded just because they need to house more cars. And that means that not only when you use a car are you inefficient because of those other ways that we mentioned before, but you're also traveling further to get from point A to point B because of all of the storage space for cars that's built into our design. So you end up creating more sort of passenger kilometers traveled and more emissions to do that. And it's a really negative feedback loop. Of course, cars are really embedded in our society, so it's not so easy to say, well, let's change that. So just to think about some of the ways that we subsidize cars. And when I say we subsidize cars, you can think of that as like the government subsidizing cars, but it's also your tax dollars. If you drive a car, then yeah, you're contributing to that, of course. Like often when you pay for gasoline, the taxes in that go towards road maintenance, depending on where you live, right? And that seems like a fair way to do it. On the other hand, everyone else is also paying for people who use cars, whether they drive or not. So that might be free parking for cars or mandatory parking minimums. So someone builds a new grocery store, and a certain amount of space that they have to pay for, right? They have to pay taxes on that space that's used up in the city. The city says, well, a minimum amount of space must be used for parking. Great, so that means other people, that means the grocery store has to raise the price of its food, right? Or the same could go for housing, makes housing more expensive because more space is given to cars rather than to people. So those are subsidies that society puts towards drivers. Similarly, society tends to turn a blind eye towards traffic violations. Like speeding is ostensibly against the law, but everyone does it, even though it results in more fatalities. A faster car will hurt someone more than a slower car, results in more mortality. But we also have a bunch of laws that favor drivers. So vehicular manslaughter sentences are weaker than just straight up manslaughter. And then there's the cost of paying healthcare. In Canada, that's public. In the US, it might just mean that your premiums are higher. So drivers benefit from having all of these things geared towards them. Non-drivers and drivers alike suffer from asthma, cancer, whatever other externalities are put towards us. And yet we tolerate all of these things, which maybe shows you how hard it is to overcome the focus on cars in our system and how hard of an ask it might be to change that system. Just as a little bit of an illustration, this is like a pet peeve. You can see even this almost more abstract subsidy in the way that we talk about this and just our assumptions about cars. So pedestrian dies after being hit by a vehicle at a crosswalk in Richmond. That's in Vancouver, where I used to live. And so you have this passive language being used. In other types of accidents, you wouldn't describe someone walking into a knife, you would describe it as a stabbing. But here you can see, so constable, so a police officer saying the pedestrian was walking in the marked crosswalk. So they absolutely had a right to be there. That really puts the onus on the driver. And yet the constable says, a very unfortunate situation for everyone involved. My thoughts are primarily with the victim's family and the victim, and also the driver, because it is a tragic event, and I'm sure nobody has the intention to go out and get involved in anything like this. And so you can just kind of see that it's this assumption that not only are cars okay, but we are okay with this trade-off in our society, that people can drive fast enough that every once in a while there will be accidents where other people who are completely innocent and abiding by the law die. And that's just the price of cars in our society. And we've seemingly come to terms with that, which like maybe we don't have to. But that being said, if you can see all of those things and then say, okay, I want to go out and find ways to change those systems to be more equitable. Or you can see those things and some people take an opposite view and just say, okay, cars are here. How do we make them better? How do we ameliorate some of these things? And so electric vehicles for the climate give you a little bit of a get out of jail free card. It's going to be really hard to hit our climate targets if everyone in the world drove as much as North Americans do. Even, you know, if we're switching over to electric vehicles, it still means that there's more energy to be produced. So then you need more renewable energy and so on, right? But it is doable. That being said, some of the gains that we've made in recent years have been offset by just a choice to drive heavier cars, which are more dangerous, require more energy, are more costly, and yet seem to be this, I don't want to call it an unstoppable trend, but a very powerful trend in the last decade. So from 2010 to 2018, we had steady emissions growth around the globe. And around the globe, a huge chunk of that emissions growth was just driven by this decision to switch to SUVs. That's not like a mandatory thing. We can, of course, choose not to drive SUVs. We could use other forms, but we do. So another action that we could take right now is to scale down the size of our cars and still use them, but maybe make better choices there. So enough about cars, stepping over a little bit to aviation. I have this question of what would aviation look like in a 1.5 degree world? So right now, air travel passengers are projected to double by the year 2036. And although aircraft keep getting better and better, it's probably not enough to offset that huge increase in demand in order to kind of stay within our carbon budget. I was going to talk about aviation in the pandemic, but just to make sure that I stay within time, I think I might skip through some of it, except to just say that emissions have dropped, but I think we can expect them to go up based on surveys and other things. Now, so in the long term, if we're looking for a longer term solution to the emissions from aviation, a lot of people will focus on different techno solutions. One such techno solution is biofuels. And we could replace a lot of our jet fuel using different plants, and that kind of would be carbon neutral, but it would take up a lot of land. And so one potential replacement that was very popular a few years ago, Jatropha, just the name of the plant, that could replace kerosene. This map shows how much land you would need to allocate for Jatropha to replace all of the oil that currently goes towards jet fuel around the world. And you can see it's quite massive. Like Canada is a big country. These are big provinces, and you would need all of that land. And so biofuels are kind of not tenable, as in, if you want to keep eating, you don't want food prices to skyrocket, or if you want to preserve any biodiversity for the future, it's not a great idea. Similarly, electric aircraft are really exciting, but they're only going to be able to do really short trips. So yes, you can fly from Boston to Washington, DC in 2050 on an electric aircraft? Absolutely. I expect that flight to be there. Can you fly from New York City to London by 2050? Almost certainly not. So if there are no sort of get out of jail free cards, we might want to kind of come to terms with this idea that we should not be on an endless loop of more and more flying. This map shows sort of how much of your own personal carbon budget could be used up by a single flight. So by 2050, emissions per capita need to be 2.1 tons of CO2 per year. Really, ideally, by 2050, we want to be hitting net zero. And so if aircraft aren't decarbonized by then, we could run into a big problem. Right now, if you're looking at that budget, you would use up the entire budget on a flight from the west coast of the US or Canada to Hong Kong and back. And yet, if you think about how our culture views flying, I like to bring up, these are screenshots from dating profiles, pictures excluded. So traveled to 51 countries so far, still counting though. Canadian, perpetually back from traveling and living abroad, checked off all continents except Antarctica. So we have this kind of Pokemon, gotta catch them all attitude to air travel. And that's problematic if we're gonna try and fight climate change. Nowhere else would you say, like, I enjoy littering in my free time and leaving my SUV idling in my driveway. That's just not okay in our culture. But air travel is seen as this signifier of status and culture. Moving along a little bit to diet, the reason why so much emissions come from livestock can sort of be traced back to its basic inefficiency. So if you were to go and eat a bunch of plants, you get all of the calories in those plants and you can burn them, and that's great. If you instead feed those calories to cattle, then the cow walks around, burns off those calories, and they're wasted forever. And so you only get, depending on the situation, 1 out of 10 calories that you started with because of the way that you've moved up the food chain. In addition to that, you have methane, and which is a very potent greenhouse gas being produced by ruminants like cattle. And so sometimes people, when I talk to them, will say, like, eating a plant-based diet, that's too much for me. I can't handle that. An alternative would just be, okay, like, drop beef from your diet. Ideally, replace it with beans. This quotation from a study I like kind of sums up how important of a shift that can be. Generally, I've looked at a lot of life cycle assessments for food, and the pattern that you're going to see is that plants are at the bottom, not a lot of CO2 per kilogram of food, and beef and other animals are at the top with just inordinately huge amounts of carbon footprint. So what can we do about this? We could just eat less meat. In the future, there might be options for lab-grown meat, though there might be issues around acceptance, but there's optimism that that techno solution could come to fruition, that we just grow cells in the lab, and that when we scale those processes up, they're going to be lower, less carbon intensive. But in the meantime, it's available in very small places and not near us. So it would be a good thing to investigate, I would say. And a lot of the time people phrase these actions as sacrifices. I would just suggest to you that there are a lot of benefits in adopting some of these lifestyles. So plant-based diets are just generally healthier, lower risk of cancer, lower risk of diabetes. Even using public transit, let alone active travel like biking or walking, decreases rates of obesity. Of course, car-free living or switching to electric vehicles reduces airborne pollutants in our communities. So there's a lot of reason to make these switches regardless of whether climate change is happening or not. And I think that we really do have the ability to make some of these changes, and there are encouraging signs out there of the way that behaviors can be contagious in a good way. So homeowners are more likely to install solar panels when they see their neighbors leading away. Similarly, food, you don't eat food alone. I mean, now we often do, but once the pandemic is over, there will be more opportunity for that, and that can influence the people around you. So there was a study done at Stanford, and they had people lining up in a cafeteria and gave them a survey. And one of the questions, they kind of like slipped in a little bit of text in there, and some of the participants read this statement that, okay, 30% of Americans make an effort to limit their meat consumption. And then another randomized group within that trial received, over the last 5 years, 30% of Americans have started to make an effort to limit their meat consumption. So the one, you have this norm, and the other, you have a dynamic norm that's suggesting that times are changing. And so then they looked at the number of participants who ordered a meatless lunch when they got to the end of that counter, and found, okay, there's a difference between the control group and those who are receiving this dynamic norm, this idea that not only do other people consider meatless diets, but there's a shift on the move. So people are cognizant of those shifts. And we saw a little bit of that beginning to happen right before the pandemic with this idea of flig scum or flight shame. So flight shame could have growth in air traffic, people in Europe starting to take more trains rather than flights because they didn't like the idea of how it was affecting their carbon footprint. And so a survey was done of some Swedes who had actually drastically reduced their flying, and asked, like, well, why have you done it? And one factor that a lot of people talked about was the urgency of the problem. Other people said that they had experienced climate change firsthand, and still others said that, well, they knew of either examples like Greta Thunberg or people in their own lives who had kind of led by example and had reduced their carbon footprint through flying. And that was a major motivator for them. And this is where I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about these movements and turn a little bit more to collective action. So not only was Greta Thunberg instrumental in creating this idea of flight shame, but much more importantly in creating the climate movement that has really burgeoned around the globe. And so I think something that comes up when people see these movements, they might ask, like, okay, a lot of people were in the street in my city. I saw photos of people around the world, but does this really matter? Kind of the other side of the coin to these individual actions that I've discussed. Like, does politics matter? And I think it does, and I think there's a reasonable amount of strong evidence for this. So for instance, one study found that in the United States, the states that have politicians with better environmental records, and those are just measured on League of Conservation voter scorecards. So you can go to League of Conservation voters and evaluate a politician for yourself, see how they've done on these different environmental bills. States that elect legislators with good voting records have lower growth in emissions. That's like one piece of correlational data, but you can add to that with other studies around the world. So Green Party strength is associated with lower air pollution in different countries. Individual power plants have lower emissions when there are more active ENGOs nearby. And basically the way that works, like the theory behind the mechanism that finding, is that these groups organize and protest, and utilities are kind of lazy and hesitant to change. They don't want to incur costs, but when there's enough protest nearby, okay, they'll take steps like installing a scrubber on their smokestack that reduces emissions. And so if you follow this idea that, okay, like it seems like we can use politics to make change, then what are the best ways to drive that change? So a survey of some members of parliament in Europe identified what politicians perceive, at least, to be the top actions, those actions that they think are most influential for everyday citizens. So politicians think that voting is at the top of the list, getting active in a political party, creating media attention. And I would just say that, of course, that can also be done through a protest. Writing a letter to a politician, an email comes after, going to a rally, a protest, demonstrating, then signing a petition. They don't have much love for internet discussions. And I've got to say that in the research that I've seen, I would tend to agree with that as well. So I always say that if you're thinking about responding to an angry comment on Reddit or Twitter, and you've got a whole paragraph lined up in your head, a whole thread of all of the arguments you're going to use, I would say take that energy and instead go write a letter to a politician who can actually have power over a situation and change something, because evidence mostly shows that people aren't receptive to strangers arguing with them on the internet. A little bit more receptive to friends and family, certainly. That can be more worth your time, but again, I wouldn't get too engaged with your angry Uncle Steve when you could just be engaging with politicians who actually have power. So boycotting comes next on the list, and then performing illegal acts at the bottom, which makes sense that politicians would dislike that as a strategy. So if you did want to spend your time contacting an elected official, how should you go about doing that? First of all, I would just flag that you don't need to be a voter, right? Maybe you're an international student, you're not from the country, that's fine. You're a resident and you can get representation from these people. You just need to live in their district. And it's critical that you tell them that you live in their district. Another thing that I would include is that generally personal handwritten letters or phone calls are viewed as more persuasive than emails. If you're going to send an email, make it personalized, right? So a lot of the time, maybe you're on a mailing list where a organization says, hey, someone's trying to build this pipeline, send an email to your representative, just click here, and you just click there. Well, they're going to be on the receiving end of that, and their staffers are going to look at it, and it'll probably be useful. It's definitely better than nothing. They might count it up in a sort of tally and say, hey, we got 20 emails, but they're all written the same way. Whereas if you do a handwritten letter, that's something that they have to open, they have to respond to, they have to send a letter back. It's going to stick in their mind. It's more likely to get passed on to the actual representative. And phone calls fall in that same area. And the kind of theory behind this is just that it signals that you care. And when legislators are receiving hundreds of emails every day, about a whole range of topics, it helps for them to stick out. Now, I wouldn't discourage you by saying it's hundreds of letters every day. Some of those are, well, like I said, generic emails where they get 40 of them and go, oh, okay, the same generic email. We're not even sure if it's a bot or not. But not all legislators get that much contact. Maybe a state senator, sure, but you can also reach out to a city councilor who maybe cares more about individual level issues. So what policies should you be asking for if you're writing to them? You can just generically ask for climate action and they're the politician, they can figure out how to implement it. If you're talking at the city level though, you can ask for better transit. You can ask for systems that don't rely on personal vehicles so much, or that create more urban density and less sprawl. And that's kind of what we talked about with bigger cities, more spread out. You need a car to travel in them, right? You can ask for more renewable energy. That might be accomplished through a renewable portfolio standard, or a price on carbon would sometimes accomplish the same thing. And you can always ask for no additional fossil fuel infrastructure. And that's just clear science that we know how much carbon we can emit into the atmosphere, and we know that we don't have space for more fossil fuel infrastructure. And so that can be no more pipelines, no more oil wells, no more fracking, but it can arguably also look like no new runways at airports, because we just can't lock those emissions in. Yeah, so that brings me to the end of my slides. I hope they were useful in some way, and I'm happy to talk to you folks. I'd love to hear comments about what you think. I'm very open to disagreement and also happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much. And we do have a question, and I'll encourage people to keep questions and comments coming in through this question and answer box that we have here in this Zoom webinar setup. So the first question is it fair to say that we encourage companies to continue their non-renewable energy extraction when legislation centered around a shift towards renewable energy is repeatedly shot down?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure where we're putting the blame on that. Like the word are we, just we is carrying a lot. Like, yes, legislators can feel responsibility for that. And to some extent, yes, everyday people can feel responsibility for that, for electing legislators that don't care about the climate, or for not putting pressure on their legislators. Now, some people have elected climate leaders and try to, and maybe your favorite politician didn't get in, and so you can feel a little bit absolved of that, and I get that. You know, some political systems are not always perfectly fair and are weighted against us, but yeah, sometimes a company doesn't have control over all of their emissions. They're just pulling energy from the grid, and if that energy is dirty, then they make more emissions, right? And so if you have a plant, like a manufacturing plant, and they're just assembling a product, it doesn't matter how energy efficient that product is, it'll have all of these embedded emissions in the life cycle if they're in a place that has an unclean grid. They could relocate to somewhere with a cleaner grid. But yeah, it is complicated, right? There's a lot of things going on there to think about.
I have another question. What is your opinion on reversing climate change through sequestering carbon into soil?
It is a little outside of my expertise, so you might encounter people who know more about it. I think it's generally a good thing. Like if you can store more carbon in soil, that's sweet. Generally more carbon content in the soil is like, that's good for agriculture, so it's a win-win there. If you can pay farmers, then you might have a win-win as well, because they're a constituency that might otherwise oppose climate action. You know, they might hear, okay, it sounds like this carbon price is going to make the fuel for my tractor more expensive. I'm not really down with that. So if you can win them over by saying, hey, we'll pay you to adopt this conservation practice, then okay, yeah, that might be a win-win. So it's worth investigating. On the other hand, I think you just wouldn't want to use it as a way of avoiding shutting down fossil fuel burning, because there's possibly a point at which the soil can't hold more carbon. So it's not like we can just keep pumping CO2 into the air, and our temperature will just get hotter and hotter. You can't just limitlessly put CO2 into the soil to offset that. It'll get saturated at a certain point, and then depending on your farming practices, that soil carbon could reverse and move from being a sink to a source. So in some ways it's subject to the same issues as planting trees, right? Like it looks good right now, but if something changes, like you have a forest fire or a pest that comes in and kills all the trees, and then there's a forest fire afterwards, you lose your stored carbon. So yeah, you just have to be careful of those things. I'm not sure what, as an individual, that there's too much that you can do there. Like it'd be hard to shop for products that did a good job sequestering carbon in the soil necessarily. And like you might be able to find them, but it might be like an onerous thing for a consumer. And then the only other thing would be pressuring politicians to do it.
We have a few really interesting questions here. So here's one. So regarding food, I was wondering if you've evaluated the energy intensity of insect-based diets. We know many Asian cultures consume insects, and there's a movement in the Netherlands to get protein from insects instead of mammals, birds, and seafood.
Yeah, it seems cool. I think it's a good idea. Your obstacle is probably not like the carbon footprint of the insect. It's just the acceptability of eating them. So I don't think like you don't need a huge amount of fertilizer. You can grow them in damp, dark places. You know, their insects aren't ruminants, so they're not creating methane. So yeah, it's great. I would just not be as optimistic about like, I think lab grown meat, you know, if we can get it to work and we can get it to taste good and we can get that price down, people will probably just eat it. You know, if you're sitting there looking at a shelf and it's like, okay, this hamburger tastes the same as this other hamburger, but one of them will, you know, one of them they needed to kill a cow and the other they didn't. Like, okay, toss up, I'll take the one that didn't kill a cow because I feel a little bit better about the animal welfare. But yeah, like if people are squeamish about that, then what is the hope for uptake of insects? If you want to do it yourself, I'd be like, yeah, more power to you. That's great. I've tried a little bit. I looked into like cricket flour, mealworm flour, and things like that, and they're expensive, or they were 3 years ago when I looked them up because we just don't make a lot, so the economies of scale aren't there.
Great. Here's another interesting question. So do you have any suggestions for how to approach people who are doing a lot of lower impact actions consistently, using reusables, using energy efficient appliances, etc., about adopting higher impact actions? Sometimes I find that people think they're already doing enough by recycling, or that higher impact actions are too difficult or expensive or time consuming to adopt.
Well, that's a great question because I feel like it absolutely should be something that I have evidence for and should know, but all my evidence would be circumstantial. I mean, I did this project largely for those people because I found that high school documents were talking about those small things and kind of seemed out of sync with the evidence. And so, you know, that's why we spent time making that infographic so that people could share it and kind of be like, oh, huh. So like recycling, not that big of a deal. Okay, like it's a good civic action. I guess I would stress like, hey, keep it up. You're doing good things, but this is where all of the real emissions are. Generally, I've come at that from a sort of position of authority. Like I have been the science teacher in the room and got to share that. You kind of got to be careful though, right? If you're like calling out a friend or a family member, that's a sensitive thing. So I'm not sure. Yeah, just being encouraging of the things that they already do, and then showing the alternative of like, hey, you can also do a lot through these other actions. But yeah, that'd be one where I'd be open to hearing anecdotes or so on. I've always looked at it from a more kind of mass communication scale rather than an interpersonal. Maybe I guess the one thing that I would say evidence-wise, it's like, it's good if you can lead by example, right? Like if you can be the one that's already going plant-based. And there is research saying that you can have a little bit of a backfire effect, like a very small one, if you are too much of a do-gooder. So I would just say, you don't want to go too far in that direction of like, I'm the perfect vegan and everything you do is wrong. But like, gentle encouragement, maybe focus on some of the co-benefits as well. A lot of people will change their diet for health reasons and not for the climate, but it's just as good for the climate if they do. Yeah, okay.
So here's another interesting question. So there's huge pushes to build climate resilience, but do you think this is misdirecting funds and attention and potentially sending the wrong message? We can make ourselves resilient to the harm from climate change to the public and allowing government to say they are doing lots of good things.
Yeah, I don't know of many places that have yet gone full adaptation and are terrible at mitigation. So like, even if you just look at the states that are really vulnerable, it's not like Florida and North Carolina have done amazing things to shore up protections for sea level rise while completely neglecting mitigation. They also have, like, they neglect mitigation, and then they also have policies in place where you're not supposed to talk about climate change when planning for extreme weather events. So I don't think that there's a huge relationship there. We're also kind of getting to the point where, like, we are experiencing these negative effects right now, so we do need to start adapting. But you're right, there's a little bit of a moral hazard there. I would say the moral hazard that we need to be like more aware of is sort of this change now towards negative emissions technologies. You might have heard of like direct air capture or BECS, which is biofuel energy with carbon capture and storage, or just carbon capture and storage. Like, hey, you know, we'll keep burning coal, but we'll just capture the CO2 that comes out of the plant. And that can kind of give legs to the fossil fuel industry and avoid change. That's maybe a little bit more of an issue. That being said, we also now are getting to the point where we need to do direct air capture and look into these technologies because we've done such a bad job of mitigating. So yeah, it's like a tightrope to walk, and it's tricky, I would say, to your question.
So I have a question about whether you have any thoughts or comments on President Biden's stance on the Keystone Pipeline.
Yeah, I think just scientifically, it falls under that, what I said before, like we can't build more fossil fuel infrastructure. When you do, you lock in emissions. It's like a stranded asset. You're investing in something. Pipelines normally have like multi-decade lifespans. So if you build something like that, you're investing billions of dollars in a project that you're expecting to continue creating cheap sources of fossil fuels and cheap greenhouse gases for decades to come. So it's pretty inconsistent to build those while trying to be a climate champion. So the science says that if you want to have a habitable planet, then you can't have very much of those new things being built.
We had a comment and then maybe one last question. Just a comment regarding sort of local change and approaching municipalities or city councils that often very local data is hard to actually access because the data isn't collected or not available as a challenge. So maybe a final question. What was most surprising about your findings? Were you surprised or were you not surprised with what you found for what individuals' actions are most impactful?
You know, I think at the time when I really first started looking into this, I was pretty convinced that local food would matter because humans just have these like shortcuts for understanding called heuristics. And so one of them is the availability heuristic. And so you judge how consequential something is by how easily you can call it to mind, right? And so lighting is really easy to call to mind because it's like it's super visible, right? We think about it all the time. So it makes sense that if you're like, oh yeah, how do I reduce my carbon footprint? Oh, I should probably turn off those lights because like they're everywhere, but really they're not making that much energy. Like again, do it. switch to LEDs. Don't let that hold you back. But it's a cognitive bias that can that you're not thinking about all of the embodied energy and fertilizer that went into your steak. And so I would say before I started that research, I would have been subject to that bias as well. I would have said like, well, look, we know that greenhouse gases come out the back of trucks. I can see it. So if a banana has to come all the way from Chile to my house, it must have huge emissions. I need to eat local. And it turns out that our food transportation is just really efficient. And if you're moving something in a truck, or even better, a boat, it doesn't take that much fossil fuels for a small amount. And so like there's a study that says you can cancel out all of the good that you were intending to do by buying local if you just drive 7 kilometers out of your way. Because we talked about those individual cars being hugely inefficient. Like think about that, your SUV driving 7 kilometers to pick up some bananas and driving back. That's a bigger carbon footprint than the banana being one of thousands that were on a big vessel that came from South America, right? So yeah, that was very unintuitive, and for me a little liberating. I put quite a bit of effort into eating local, and I wouldn't knock it. Like it's nice to know where your food comes from, but now I just felt less guilty about like I really like oranges, and now I'm able to eat oranges even though I live in Canada, rather than forcing myself to eat cabbage all winter. And instead I'll go with fewer steaks. And that was like a very pleasant, surprising trade-off for me.
Well, on that note, on that happy note, I'd just like to thank you very much for sharing your time and your research today. I'd like to thank all of the participants. Thank you for your good questions. Please do join us next week, and I will say thank you and goodbye to all. Bye.
Thanks so much.